Good afternoon again, and welcome to today's webinar, Does My EPUB Meet Industry Expectations? We're pleased today to be able to welcome Rachel Comerford, who's Senior Director of Accessibility Outreach and Communication at Macmillan Learning. Beyond her day-to-day job at Macmillan, Rachel also serves as BISG's Workflow Committee Chair and has been instrumental in the conversations that led to launching this what we call coffee break webinar series, of which this is the first for the workflow committee and in its efforts. Rachel, welcome. Thank you. And I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today's EPUB coffee break conversation is about whether or not your EPUB meets industry expectations. So the topics that we're going to cover today include just what is the workflow committee in general, who are these people coming to you with this information, and then what problem are we trying to solve today, which is how do I make sure that my EPUB meets standards. From there, we'll talk about why EPUB, what are the standards, and of course, what solutions are available. So the workflow committee is chaired by myself, Rachel Comerford, Macmillan Learning. I did provide access to the committee charter here, and I'm sure Brian will make these slides available. Our primary objective is to create a standard definition of workflow for the industry, to document best practices, and to identify and create resources to improve approaches that are already in place. So along those lines, making sure that an EPUB meets standards. I've outlined a 5-step process here to sort of simplify the approach. The first step is just to make sure that your EPUBs are carefully designed and proofread. Following that, we'll talk about EPUBCheck from the W3C. We'll talk about ACE, which is an accessibility checker by Daisy, as well as SMART. And then finally, about any additional requirements from large vendors in the EPUB market. So starting with attention to detail, I feel like this is one of those things that we think about in the publishing industry very carefully when it comes to a print product. Think about how things look and how things flow and where images are placed. Traditionally, the ebook tends to follow the print book in its creation, and so sometimes doesn't get the same level of quality assurance that our print books do. And as ebook sales rise and we see a really increased market for ebooks, it's really important to implement the same sort of quality assurance for print books that you have for ebooks. It's important as a part of that process to do a review on all different sorts of devices. Your readers might be using an app on their phone, they might be using a Kindle, they might be using a Nook. So using those devices or using a simulator that replicates those devices will give you a view into what your readers are going to see. Watch for typos or formatting that can confuse the reader. Again, this may seem like publishing 101, but it can be missed or forgotten when it comes to the production of the ebook that comes after that print piece. Specifically to ebooks, we need to check things like reflows to make sure that lines break at reasonable places. You're not accidentally creating some really disturbing widows or orphans within their text. And to make sure that the text reflows around images in a sensible way. And I say this because it is very easy to end up breaking a sentence over an image and maybe making it a little bit harder for your reader to understand the flow of the basal text. And then finally, confirm that images actually appear and that they're not pixelated or stretched, but that they make sense for the user. We've seen all sorts of interesting issues in ebooks being published, from they're turning into just black boxes in the ebook to finding out that we had enormous pictures of the founder of Facebook and then tiny, tiny pictures of graphs, just because the source file presented something completely different from what we actually wanted to see in the ebook. These are all good reminders just for the types of details that you should keep in mind as you're making sure that your ebook is meeting the needs of your users. But now into the actual tools that will help you get there. So the first tool that I want to talk about is EPUBCheck. EPUBCheck checks against the EPUB3 standards developed by the W3C. I've provided a link here to the working draft of 3.3, which is the standard in process. And then you can also get access to 3.2 from that page, which is the current standard that's being checked against in EPUBCheck. To download EPUBCheck, you can go to the w3.org page. Again, it's owned by the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. They help establish standards like the WCAG standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and even the HTML standards that we're all familiar with. Once you open the EPUB validation tools open source, and it checks against all of the current and past EPUB standards, so you know you're getting backwards compatibility. The one drawback to using this is that it is a command line tool. So if you're not familiar with command line tools, they can look a little bit scary to somebody who's not used them before. I can assure you that there are some really, really detailed directions available on the w3.org page about how to use EPUBCheck. But this is the type of screen that you'll see with when you're doing this in the command line. So if you're using an Apple, you'll be seeing this in terminal. But it tells you that you're validating an EPUB against a specific set of rules. It tells you where errors have come up in parsing file. In this case, we see the element type IMG must be terminated by the matching end tag. So it's missing an M10. And after the check is finished, it says that there's one fatal error, one error, 0 warnings, and 0 just informational pieces. A clear EPUB check that passes without any errors will give you a message saying no errors or warnings detected. And you'll see that there are 0 fatal, 0 errors, 0 warnings, and 0 information. If you're uncomfortable with a command line tool, which is okay, and we hear from a lot of people that they are, there are a bunch of tools out there that make use of EPUBCheck in the backend and give you a much more comfortable user interface. So I provided links to 4 different EPUBCheck apps. One is the Pagina EPUB Checker, which is available on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. The EPUBCheck GUI, the GUI being the guided user interface by Peter Hanrahan, also available on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. There's another EPUBCheck GUI by Stephen Kreutzer, which is available for Windows and Linux. And of course, eCheck by Jose Quintera, which is available for Macs. There are a couple of other tools available as well. The EPUB3 tests is a script for running a folder of files through EPUBCheck and outputting results in a single text file. This is created by Wendy Reed. And also JHOVE, the JSTOR Harvard Object Validation Environment, which allows you to take a look at the collection of objects as well. The second tool that I wanted everyone to become aware of is ACE by DAISY. DAISY is a not-for-profit organization that works primarily in the disability and accessibility worlds. ACE was a tool created by them also to be a free and open source tool. It's designed to check the accessibility of a file. So this checks against the EPUB accessibility standard, also maintained by the W3C, again, the World Wide Web Consortium. It also checks against WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are maintained by the W3C. There are 2 different versions of this tool. One is the command line tool, and we saw some images to show you what a command line tool looks like with EPUBCheck. And then, of course, there is a desktop GUI, which is the guided user interface. And that's a little bit easier to use for someone who's not familiar with the command line. ACE by Daisy within the command line will give you line by line error messages to let you know where an error has been found and what type of error is there. This includes the XHTML file that it's found in, and then the error within the XHTML file. You can also get an EPUB accessibility report from ACE, which is super easy to read, much more simple than the command line report. And this will give you a list of all of the violations. Unfortunately, this screenshot's a little bit tight, and so it's a bit hard to see, but you can see the impact of the issue. In this case, all of the issues are minor. You can see what rule set it impacts. The 4 that are featured here are within the best practices. The individual rules within WCAG or within the EPUB accessibility guidelines that, that I linked to earlier that are affected by the error. And then of course, the location of the error and the details of the problem. You do get an overview, a summary of violations, so you can see overall where you are with your EPUB. In this case, this EPUB has 3 serious violations, 1 moderate, and then there are 28 areas that need to be checked against best practices. These are all minor. You can also use this report to check the accessibility metadata in the file. The accessibility metadata is something that you build into your EPUB, and it uses the schema.org metadata set. You decide what's being put in here, but this is a great way to check what you've done and to see if anything needs to change or needs to be added. In this case, we see, we have a report that shows that there is schema accessibility features, there's no schema accessibility hazards. There's no accessibility summary yet. It says it's in progress and no image descriptions yet. So this is a book that's still being worked on. And it also shows the access mode and access mode sufficient. That metadata that is shown there is also exposed in some of the reading systems that your ebook will go to. This is a look at the VitalSource catalog with the exposed metadata. This is actually from a Macmillan title. It includes the accessibility summary. In this case, it says, this publication conforms to WCAG 2.0 level AA. Long description is present using ARIA described by. And it asks that the user enable punctuation in their assistive technology in order to hear some of the necessary pedagogical information. And then it goes into all of the detailed tags that are being used within the metadata, including noting that it includes a table of contents, print page numbers, described math, structural navigation, keyboard control, mouse control, all pieces of information that will be necessary to make sure that your ebook is meeting different parts of the accessibility industry standards. So the last tool is SMART by Daisy, and SMART stands for Simple Manual Accessibility Reporting Tool. SMART can also be integrated with ACE by Daisy, and it provides manual conformance checks, which are necessary to ensure conformance with the EPUB and the WCAG requirements. This is because you can automate checking for a significant portion of this process, but not for everything. And so some things are going to require that you, as a human, take a look at something and make sure that it's working the way it's supposed to, or that it's present. So SMART guides you through that process. And then the checkpoints are tailored based on the properties of the publication that you have. This is not free and open. It's offered directly by Daisy to their members as a part of a consulting or auditing service. It's also included in their inclusive publishing partner membership. Once you import an ACE check into SMART, You do get a report letting you know what's been imported. This says that the following content types were not found in the publication. That's page breaks and media overlays. So it's not going to include those in your manual checking. But it does see alternative text and reading order, which will be included in your manual checking. There's a conformance verification in SMART, which allows you to set which level of WCAG you are attempting to be compatible with. It also allows you to exclude tests if you have no images in your file or no audio or video. You can remove those requirements from your process. And then it also has the metadata. And this allows you to see what types of metadata you can apply within your book. It also allows you to actually generate the metadata tags. So you can take this and put it back into your ebook code. So to jump into some of those additional requirements that I mentioned earlier, each e-reader and ebook distributor may have their own requirements in addition to the industry standards. It might be different for trade or higher ed or journals, and you should really check with the partners that you work with the most to make sure that you understand their standards and how it impacts the titles that you're working with. I included links to a few examples here, Amazon's VitalSource and Kobo. And these are all just very specific guidelines about how to make a book work well within any of those reading systems. There's another way to include metadata, which is with the delivery of a file, and that's using Onyx. And I've provided a link to more information about Onyx metadata in a following slide. You should always make sure that it's compatible with older reading systems. You don't know if your readers have updated to the latest version of the Kindle. And so it's important to include an NCX file to make sure that it's compatible with Kindle, Adobe Digital Editions, and others. And then you can also make use of industry tools that check against multiple requirement sets. So a tool like Flight Deck, which I've linked to here, will actually check those individual standards that each or some of the e-readers and ebook distributors have, and give you an idea of how well your book will work within those environments. And then finally, some additional resources. So the DAISY Accessible Publishing Knowledge Base will give you lots of information about how to build an EPUB that meets the accessibility and EPUBCheck requirements. We have the Inclusive Publishing Initiative, which is a great general resource for accessible publishing information. And then we have the overview of accessibility metadata, which is hosted on inclusivepublishing.org. And that includes information about Onyx and schema.org accessibility metadata, which I mentioned earlier. And with that, I made it 2 minutes under the 20 minutes that I was going for. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself.
Well, that actually is almost always one of our goals, to make you feel pretty good about yourself. Thank you, Rachel. This is a really helpful overview of the tools and resources that are available for us to do good work for EPUB and accessibility for digital content. I've put a note in the chat about questions, and I'm sure some more will come in. But in the meantime, we did have one along the way when you were speaking about would this presentation be made available. I just want to underscore the answer I gave, which is yes. Well, it's a Google document, so we'll include a link in the update that we give to everybody as well with a link to the recorded presentation. The one question that I wanted to start with, EPUBCheck, how is it maintained and who pays for it?
Well, my standard line in response to that is that EPUBCheck is not actually free, but EPUBCheck is maintained largely by volunteers. There was a fundraising effort that is ongoing for EPUBCheck in order to keep it up to the most recent standards and to make sure that it is functional for all users. And so I encourage people to check out the w3.org page to get more information there.
Thanks. A question came in from Jennifer about the same time that Tyler Carey complimented you for the work that you've done. Jennifer is asking, is there a separate place to go for standards for fixed layouts versus reflowable? This might be a good chance to talk about the work that's actually underway right now in the workflow committee.
Yes, so there is a separate standard for fixed layout. There is some work that's ongoing within the W3C publishing group to establish accessible standards for a fixed layout. There is also a BISG field guide, the field guide to fixed layout for ebooks, that's being compiled by the workflow committee. We're in the process of editing that file now. It was originally produced in, I think, 2013, and we'll be re-releasing it hopefully before the end of the year.
I think that may be a little bit ambitious, but if we get it,
at the beginning of next year.
if we get it done before the end of December, all credit goes to you. Talk a little bit about the time to learn command line programs, because I think in the presentation you kind of have given people options. Should we be scared about command line, or should we be learning it?
I think everybody should learn how to use their command line. It is it's a great way to be able to access tools like this that don't have these really pretty user interfaces, but give you really, really solid information about the status of the product that you're working on. Command line tools are fairly easy to learn. And there are a lot of resources out there for getting just like the basics of how the commands should be coded. As I learned how to use command line largely for EPUBCheck, I kept sort of a cheat sheet of the commands that I needed to run in order to fetch information and start running reports. And what I found is that the more often I did it, the more comfortable I became with it, and the more comfortable I became experimenting with it. So I've yet to break anything significantly. I feel like that will be the landmark day in my using the command line. But I do think it's an important tool for people to learn how to use.
And Beth, who's part of the audience today, adds yes command line to the chat. Is there a difference in the functionality or the quality of the results between the command line options and others? In other words, as they add a better graphic user interface, is there a little bit of trade-off in performance or the quality of the feedback that you get?
It can be a little bit slower depending on the programming for the GUI. And it can take some time to learn how to read a report coming out of a command line tool. But all in all, I would say that the result is generally the same.
Okay, thank you. On the last page before this, you had a list of some resources, and I'm wondering, we did a workshop in June that you were part of and helped lead on the accessibility metadata in digital products. There's a link to that presentation that's available on the BISG website. Perhaps we can add that there too, because that was a good 90-minute workshop type discussion of both the possibilities and the practices that would support adding accessibility metadata.
That is a great idea. Make sure to do that.
You mentioned a couple of times WCAG. Maybe you talk first, what is WCAG, and then we can talk, I'll ask you separately about the levels.
Yeah, so WCAG are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are the guidelines that are created by the World Wide Web Consortium to assess how accessible a platform or product is on the web. It certainly applies to EPUBs as they use basic web programming techniques like HTML and CSS. And so we are able to use those standards to apply against ebooks as well. We mentioned the different levels. There are 3 different levels to WCAG. There's A, AA, and AAA. A being sort of a baseline level, AA being the level that many companies are aiming for right now. And then AAA would be the most accessible of the 3 standards.
So the purpose of having giving you the ability to select in the tool is that it's not going to give you, if you pick A, then it's not going to give you the error messages that would be consistent, that would fall out of double A or triple A.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then talk a little bit about the NCX file and how it helps maintain or at least direct backwards compatibility.
So the NCX file is a different type of navigation file that can be included within your EPUB. There is also a nav file, which a lot of the modern reading systems use. We largely include NCX in standards so that we can make sure that the EPUB is going to be navigable within an older Kindle, the older Adobe digital editions. It just gives the reading system an idea of how to get through from the start to the finish in the ebook.
Yeah, kind of a related question from one of the folks who's attending. If you have an older EPUB file, so I guess anything in the backlist, is it necessary to recheck it against current standards? And does this need to be done each time the new set of standards comes out through the W3C?
Maintaining a backlist is really tricky. And I think that a lot of publishers struggle with this. As we moved our own titles at Macmillan Learning into the newest EPUB standards, what we decided to do was take a look at our best-selling titles, the titles that were getting the most usage, and make sure that those were up to date to the newest standards. We actually touched on about 200 titles when we did that, but there was still a significant backlist that we didn't touch on. And we tend to take a look at those one title at a time. So if a customer comes forward and says, this isn't working on this particular platform, we say, okay, there may be some adjustment that we need to do. I do think it's important that as long as the book continues to be a part of a significant audience, then keeping it up to date with the standards is important. And it's sort of part of the beauty of ebooks in general, in that they have that potential to continue to be updated to meet the needs of a changing technical world, but also just a changing world. And so there's opportunities to provide updates in there that you don't necessarily have with a print book on somebody's bookshelf.
So it sounds like the filter there is, the answer is yes.
It was a long yes.
Well, it is worth going backwards and making sure that you're still relevant, because it will provide the broadest possible access. But if you have a file, for example, where the NCX file is not there, or that you never did an accessibility check, if the sales are limited, you can make a cost-benefit decision about whether you're going to support that or go through and update it.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's probably not a bad idea to sample, to go into some of that backlist and just test it against some of the tools you've described today and get a sense of how much work would be involved.
That makes a lot of sense.
Rachel, I think we're just about at time. I want to thank you again, both for preparing this this session and for kind of bringing us up to date on some of the core tools. I think that you're showing some of the things that we're planning to do over the next 4 months. These are the coffee break webinars that are each about, like today is 30 minutes long, focus on a single function. The next one, talking about alt text, will be in December. And then we have 3 others planned for January, February, and March. We may continue it after that if we think of interesting, innovative topics that seem to regularly come up in the workflow committee. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to talking with you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.